The past 2 months, this plugin has lived on my master bus, and I haven't been able to show you it until today. It has 2 knobs, one of which I really like because I don't have anything else tool-wise that does it, and we're gonna analyze this, listen to it, and understand exactly how it's impacted my mastering workflow in a big way in 2025. Describe this plugin in 10 words.
This is the closest I have come to magic.
Ooh, also, who's that guy? That is Rick Carson from Make Believe Studios, who worked alongside this with Metric Halo and Chris Geringer to bring it all to life. So I'm going to interject some of our conversation that we had in this video because he has some really unique insights on this plugin, which I wanted to share with you guys. But before we dive in, here is something for free, the Ultimate Mixing and Mastering Toolbox. It is a full database of all the tools I use, software and hardware, all organized. You can see the stuff I'm using and also get great tidbits, presets and tutorials on it all. Now let's dive into this. It has a density knob, a loudness knob. The loudness one we'll ignore for now. We're going to look at the density knob. I sort of get the verbiage of the name density, but for me, it's a very unique transient expander. And we're going to look at this. So, what does this knob do? Basically, this knob here is a threshold setting. Okay, so at 30, it will take every signal above -30, so that's at 30, every signal above -30, and apply a parabolic expansion maths to it. So it's like, okay, for every sample over 30, it factorizes and increases the sample value, but it doesn't work like a normal expander where it has a fixed ratio and just goes over 0. It actually has a center point where it has a maximum amount of gain amplification to the sample, and then it tapers off to the ceiling. This is very similar and very unique. It's very similar, but also very unique. It's similar to how I've explored soft clipping, because soft clipping, this is an arctangent function here. It's just a mathematical function that takes the samples and then replots those samples based on a mathematical function. This is basically the inverse of soft clipping, where it's expanding these sample values. Now, the reason why this impresses me is because I struggle to use expanders in mastering because they chew up a lot of headroom. Here's Pro G2 in upward mode, which is basically expansion mode, and it has a fixed ratio. So this CG2, the density, has a parabolic function where it returns back to the ceiling, basically, whereas Pro G2 has a fixed ratio. Now, yes, you can limit the range, so if I limit the range, that's a bit better, but still, you end up over 0 at the end of this transfer function. So traditional expanders, I struggle with to use in mastering, whereas this is beautiful, pragmatic, and easy to use. The beautiful thing about this curve as well is that at -30 threshold, everything's boosted quite a bit. There's about 6.5 to 7 decibels of boost at its maximum sample point at -15 decibels. Whereas as you bring it down, that parabolic curve actually becomes smaller, so the overall gain boost actually minimizes. And typically what ends up happening is I end up working in a range of here, at around nothing to 9 o'clock, where I'm getting about 0.5 decibel of boost just on the transients. Now, I plotted everything out on a piece of paper. Like I said, I shared that on my story without telling anybody what it actually was. But I also made a spreadsheet, which is here. And this is where I just went over every density setting and plotted it out. So this way, I at least know how much boost I'm going to get. Now, what does this actually sound like? And don't worry, we're going to do null tests with this as well. So that's the raw track. It's a bouncing dance record. It's very typical of me to be leaning on CG2 for tracks like this, dance tracks, things that need to pump and move out of the speaker a bit. Now, if we look at the raw mix here over in Isotope Audio Editor, I've set the threshold to -7, okay? And that just about captures most of the transients without getting too much of the body of everything. And if we look at the transfer curve here, a plugin doctor, if I have the threshold set at -7, I'm going to get, let's just look over at the other scale on the side there, we're going to get about 0.5 dB of boost, maybe close to a decibel of boost on the transients above -7, but it's going to taper off against the ceiling and not overshoot. let's have a listen to what that sounds like before and after. It's a very subtle push just to the top of those transients. Now, if you want to hear exactly what it's doing, I've set up a null test here. And basically what this is I've got CG2 engaged, but the loudness is at 0, the density is at 0. That's basically just because the plugin itself, even with the density off, it has a bit of a second order harmonic it introduces. So unless I have that in, we're not going to hear the effect of the density itself. And then I've got the phase inverted here. So what we're going to do is we'll listen to the delta signal, but then I might also move the density knob so we can hear what happens when we capture more of the transient and into the body versus where we just start off at 0. So let's take and start a listen at 7, because that's what I ended up dialing in for this test. That's the portion of the signal it's expanding. And you can hear, once you get to -15, if I go over here, you've got pretty much all the body of the track you're expanding. So this is why it's important to be very conscious of where your transients are when you use this. Now, that's my favorite part about this as a plugin. And now I'm going to show you how I've used this in this actual session to leverage it to get a little bit more out of this track when I've finished mastering it. Now, the reason why this plugin was created, I'm actually going to let Rick explain this, because I had a call with him and I think he explained it perfectly, and it really lines up with my use case for it.
What I found is you brought up an interesting point earlier in our conversation, which is you said that you found that it's best to have your program material hitting close to 0 dB before you drive it into CG2. And CG2 was really designed around that concept. It came from Chris and I and everybody. We all went out to breakfast at this spot over next to Sterling, and we were eating French toast, and Chris said, the problem that I have is that I get sent some of the best mixes in the world, and they're already loud because people need to be loud to be competitive during mixing nowadays. So, these people are already tremendous at their job and things sound great, and people come to me and they say, make it sound better and louder.
This density mode on this master is at 3. Okay, because by the time I finish putting my chain together and getting it to a point where I'm really enjoying it, especially for dance music, sometimes I just like a little bit of extra dimensionality. And here is pre-CG2 in the actual mastering chain for this track, how hot the signal is. I always make sure before I hit CG2, I gain up to 0 decibels. So pre-CG2, I typically have something like vintage limiter, where I'm just using this to get the transients up to the ceiling. So now everything's at 0. With the density mode, I dialed it at 3, which people probably think, oh, you're only giving it an extra 0.25 to 0.3 decibels of extra transient boost, but it's actually doing quite a bit. It's just taking those transients there and just lifting and thickening them up a bit. It's not doing anything to the body of the signal at all, which is why I really, really like and enjoy this plugin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create, I've got an A version. I'm going to create a B version with the density all the way down. Okay. So take a listen to this and we'll skip between A and B. Very, very subtle. And because it's so subtle, I've actually got a delta signal here, so we can actually compare the two together. So we've got the density 0. This should be density 3. Beautiful. And here is the delta signal, so you can hear exactly what part of the transient it's lifting up with that parabolic curve. It's just taking those transients, as you can hear in the delta signal, and lifting it, just tickling it a bit and bringing it out. Now, in terms of the overall loudness of this master, this final master got really loud. I ended up using 7 on this loudness. It's not a traditional limiter, he explained to me. What was your development for the limiter? Or the
Well, so
loudness knob?
so one, it's not actually a limiter over there. The only limiter
what
that's in CG2 was actually developed after NAM, and that's the true peak limiter that you turn on when you hit the true
Oh,
peak
yeah.
button. You know,
Yeah.
the loudness process, you know, if you could call it saturation, or on the harder side, a clipper, if you wanted to go that way. For, you know, I like to think of it as an intelligent clipper because of how it goes about choosing what to actually saturate. But it was never developed, my guy. This is the funniest thing about it, is it was found. You know, BJ, he had another thing that he was working on, and he said, "Hey, man, come check this out." And it was a compressor. You know, it had attack, release, input, threshold, and a control called curve, which was supposed to change the hysteresis of the attack and release times. And I went and I set this compressor up, input, attack, release, threshold, and got it set, feeling good. I got to the final control curve, and when I turned it, the song just got fucking louder. And I was listening to 50 Ways to Lose Your Lover by Paul Simon, because that's one of my favorite reference mixes. And it was just incredibly loud. And BJ was in the kitchen grabbing coffee, and I went and grabbed it. I was like, dude, this is so loud. You got to listen to it. And he's like, how loud is it? And it was negative 1.7 lufs. And we were just like, what the fuck? And so, we went and we changed the attack, I believe, of the processor, and it just got quiet. So we just slowly turned that back up to where it was, and then it was loud again. And we were like, okay, something's happening. And then he went, of course, and figured out what was happening. But I told him to just take that and then hide those other 4 knobs and just give me that one knob. And that's what we started with, was the knob, And we have officially turned that whole thing into 2 separate knobs, because there's a version of this that is in John Haynes' new plugin Meld that is more fine-tuned for information that lives around -18, because Atmos lives around -18.
Okay, it makes sense.
Where Chris's, it was just like, when I got the thing, I mean, Chris has become a friend, and of course his job is loud. So I called him and I was like, hey man, is this as cool as I fucking think it is? And it was just a white knob. And he was like, yep, that's pretty cool.
And I don't always lean on this loudness knob, to be honest. This isn't why I'd recommend CG2, even though Rick absolutely loves it, and the team at Make Believe have really pushed towards this being a unit that can get stuff super loud. The magic to me is in this density knob. The loudness knob I'm using on tracks with a very specific use case. I want the low end to remain rounded, especially in dance music. Now, whilst the Hammerstein graph isn't going to be the best representation of how this limiter is operating, this here is a plot of the CG2. It remains relatively linear all the way through, and then it starts to dip off in the top end on that fundamental, and on the 5th order harmonic, it is dead straight, just tracking along it, even amount of harmonics all the way through. Whereas if we look at the maximizer over the CG2, so we'll put the maximizer on now, it dips in the low end in lieu of more 3rd and 5th order harmonics down low. They're like super, super strong. However, and this is sort of my issue, all the fundamental is tailed off, which I'm not a big fan of, in opposition to something that reflects this sort of harmonic structure where you have more of a consistent 5th order harmonic, which might not be super desirable, but you don't get this tail off in the fundamental of the low end, which is nice. Now, I don't think the loudness is a full use case for every situation, because the harmonics are so strong on any slower envelopes. I had a master which went out the other day, and I missed it. The client actually picked it up, and they came back to me, and they're like, do you realize the 808 swell before the verse is completely crackling out? And I hadn't realized. I was a bit annoyed at myself, but I went back to check it, and it was actually because it has such a strong harmonic when you're driving this limiter or this loudness box as CG2, it produces quite rich harmonics, and if the envelopes of any sounds are too slow, it starts to break up. For quick transients, it's great. For this dance song, it's perfect. I wouldn't be using this on anything with sustained envelopes. I'd probably go to something like classic mode in Maximizer, or what's the other tool? FabFilter Pro L2 is really great with more open, non-transient information. But for this use case, it was perfect. It's a dance track, it's hitting, it's slapping. This sort of neutrality in the low end and the subs is exactly what I call for with, especially when a producer sends it off and they're like, hey, I do not want to lose sub energy. That's like really important because the mixes are typically punching and moving, and then you start to choke it in mastering and the subs disappear. So anyway, that's my sort of wrap up on this plugin. I had a great time chatting with Rick about it. He's super nice. And I'm going to leave some of our discussion at the end of this video for you guys to enjoy, because I spent an hour with him chatting about this plugin, and whilst I wanted to share with you how I'm using it, I want to give him the platform because number one, he's a really nice guy, and he sees this plugin very differently to me because he's a very creative type in the way he's approached this, which is great. But I respect his ability to connect the dots between a tool as this with contemporary issues we face as engineers, like loudness and labels and clients, the way they interpret information and respecting their mixes. So yeah, I'm going to leave it with you there. And until next time, take care.
Joke has been, it's not even a joke, but this story has been going around because there were people who witnessed it. But I'll say it here. I did that Wiz Khalifa record. I mastered 23 songs in 24 minutes on AirPods on a back porch while smoking joints and eating Rolos in front of at least 7 other Nashville engineers while they timed me, and it was a number 1 record. And there was no way in fucking hell that would have happened without.
Describe this plugin in 10 words.
This is the closest I have come to magic.
This is the closest I have come to magic. You're a real salesperson, man. You're a marketing genius. You know what? On a technical level, why has it lived on my mix bus? The density, I tracked it on a ramp signal in Plugin Doctor, and I'm going to put the plots up for people to see. The density does this weird parabolic expansion the more you dial it in, but only to signals above a certain threshold. And I tried recreating it with series of gates and parallel filters and whatnot, and I really couldn't, even though the numbers were very simple. So maybe you can help explain to me what it is actually doing to just expand those peak values, but it does it parabolically because it still hits the ceiling at 0. It doesn't go over.
Yeah, I can't get into a complete detailed technical explanation of that. That's something that you'd have to talk to BJ about. I can only give the layman's term explanation of how that makes me feel and, when I came across it, what I heard. But it's a very interesting part of density because while density is primarily designed and built to focus on lower level information, it does this interesting thing to transient information. And how I've always described density to people is, and this is not what it is, but it's almost like the accumulative effect of taking 20 very low ratio compressors that are in series and have extremely shallow ratios, 1 to 0 to 4, 1 to 0 to 7, very small ratios. And as you get further in this line of compressors, you expand their attack and release times. So there's something interesting that happens when a transient pushes its way through this whole process. This happens. And I'm not saying that it is 20 compressors by any means, but when a transient not the low level information, but that peak is able to come through the it's envelope shaped in a way by these slightly altering attack and release times, and that's not what's actually happening, but that's kind of how I perceive it, in a way that is very, very analog, and it's a completely digital process. But to my ears, it sounds great. It reminds me of almost like that initial onset distortion that happens when you hit a piece of tube gear hard.
Mm.
And I've never compared, density to a piece of tube gear because that's not what we were trying to accomplish at all with it. But there's this, and it's what you're probably hearing, but this initial little,
Perfect. That is at full. Do you see that
yes,
curve? So it
yes,
hits that threshold and then it opens up. Now typically an expander will just keep going into the ceiling and you'll go over unity or zero at the
yes,
ceiling. And it's useless because then you have to chop those transients off. Whereas what this does is it takes these values across the yellow line that are
hmm,
existing and then plots it on a curve that expands it but then tails back to zero at the top. Because if
yes,
you see the loudness, I haven't got that dialed in at all. I'm not hitting any limiters at all. I'm just using the density function there. Um, and then if we go to 1 o'clock, you see that curve starts to close up. The threshold starts to shift up, and it's
yep,
less pronounced. And then here's my sort of use case, what it looks like on a negative 50 dB scale plot. It's like this little mini bump there, but if we zoom in, it's doing like about half a dB just to those transients at the very top there.
yes, yes, absolutely. And it's interesting that you're pointing this out because if you go back to this, yes, that example when you're at full bore, you can see what's interesting is that, it's pretty much trying to go and manage the dynamic information that happens in the middle area of the music in terms of loudness, because this has nothing
Yeah.
to do with frequency response. It's trying to stay away from the top as much as possible while doing what it can to stuff that lives in the middle of the dynamic range, which, happens to be the
Yeah.
peak information. And,
Yeah.
you know, when I see something like this, it's pretty interesting to me because I think my headphones may die soon, but it's pretty interesting to me because I can hear how it works on the low end and how this helps bring excitement to the high end. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, completely. Well, what is a little trick for anybody who's using that density mode? This I'm using the word parabolic or parabola, not that that's a literal transfer, it's more just a descriptive word. I'm not very um I didn't do very well in I did well in maths, but I wasn't doing calculus or polynomial formulas in high school. But so it's sort of just an approximation of what I'm seeing there, like a curve. It's a curve. That
Yes.
particular curve, um, the best way to leverage that density mode is before you hit the plugin, have your peaks at 0 dB before you hit it.
Mm-hmm. Because then you're
Because
doing
let
is oh, go ahead.
because let's say you're like here where it's at 1 o'clock, if your peaks are at negative 18, none of them are going to transfer on that curve, even though you're at 1 o'clock.
Yep.
So the harmonics might, I'm not sure how it tracks based on input signal, but if you want to get that sort of transient bump before you hit the plugin, I always have something like the vintage limiter by uh, Ozone beforehand, just to get my level up to 0 before I hit it.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite things about CG2 is how I have not had to rely on limiters as a tool for loudness anymore, and I can rely on them as a tool for the sound. For the past 10 years, really, we've all been shoehorned into using a ton of limiting really to be able to get to where people want to be modern level wise, and you kind of have to pick and choose your battles for less loss of better words. But
Mm.
some things work well for others, some things don't work well. And now what I found is that I can use the limiters that I love because of the tone that they impart to the song, and I can use them in the range that they feel great at, a dB or two, and then hopefully rely on CG2 to get me as loud as I need to be.
Mm.
What I found is you brought up an interesting point earlier in our conversation, which is you said that you found that it's best to have your program material hitting close to 0 dB before you drive it into CG2. And CG2 was really designed around that concept. It came from Chris and I and everybody. We all went out to breakfast at this spot over next to Sterling, and we were eating French toast. And Chris said, the problem that I have is that I get sent some of the best mixes in the world, and they're already loud because people need to be loud to be competitive during mixing nowadays. So, these people are already tremendous at their job and things sound great. And people come to me and they say, make it sound better and louder, you know? And we had a conversation about much like the one we just had previously, where every tool to do that was something that was pretty heavy handed in some way, shape, or form. And you were picking, the best out of what you were trying to accomplish. Like if the low end was really important, then maybe you gave up a little bit of high end clarity to not fuck up the low end. Maybe you could eat up a little bit of the low end to make sure that the space and the openness and the 3D width, was as nice as that you needed it to be with some tools. Where, what he was hoping for is like, oh, a song's -6, like you got anything that'll give me half a dB without doing really much of anything, you know? And
Mm.
um, I initially stumbled upon the loudness knob, which I hoped solved that, and for a large majority of songs, it does. You've used this thing for the past couple of months. You and I both know it doesn't work on every single song, but in my findings, it works on maybe 90% of them that I've come across,
Yeah.
and
What was your development for the limiter or the
well, so
loudness knob?
so one, it's not actually a limiter over there. The only
Okay.
limiter
What?
that's in CG2 was actually developed after NAM, and that's the true peak limiter that you turn on when you hit the true
Oh
peak
yeah.
button.
Yeah.
The loudness process, if you could call it saturation, or on the harder side, a clipper, if you wanted to go that way. For
Mm.
I like to think of it as an intelligent clipper because of how it goes about choosing what to actually saturate. But it was never developed, my guy. This is the funniest thing about it is it was found. BJ,
Mm.
he had another thing that he was working on, and he said, "Hey man, come check this out." And it was a compressor. It had attack, release, input, threshold, and a control called curve, which was supposed to change the
Mm.
hysteresis of the attack and release times. And I went and I set this compressor up, input, attack, release, threshold, and got it set, feeling good. I got to the final control curve, and when I turned it, the song just got fucking louder. And I was listening to 50 Ways to Lose Your Lover by Paul Simon because that's one of my favorite reference mixes. And it was just incredibly loud. And BJ was in the kitchen grabbing coffee, and I went and grabbed it. I was like, dude, this is so loud. You got to listen to it. And he's like, how loud is it? And it was negative 1.7 lufs. And we were just like, what the fuck? And so, we went and we changed the attack, I believe, of the processor, and it just got quiet. So we just slowly turned
Mm.
that back up to where it was, and then it was loud again. And we were like, okay, something's happening. And then he went, of course, and figured out what was happening. But I told him to just take that and then hide those other four knobs and just give me that one knob. And that's what we started with,
Mm.
was the knob. And we have officially turned that whole thing into two separate knobs because there's a version of this that is in John Haynes' new plugin Meld that is more fine-tuned for information that lives around -18 because Atmos lives around -18.
Okay. It
Um,
makes sense.
You know, where Chris's, it was just like when I got the thing, I mean, Chris has become a friend, and of course, his job is loud. So I called him and I was like, hey, man, is this as cool as I fucking think it is? And it was just a white knob. And he was like, yep, that's pretty cool. And so I was like, okay. And then a couple days later, we were working on something else and we kind of ran into a similar situation. Not quite the same as far as we found something. We went into it with a little bit more intention, and then really there was a whole process of things as you're finding with the density knob. And I was like, okay, that's really cool. Just take this knob. This is the only knob I care about out of that whole process. You know, I was like, I want
Yeah.
to turn this knob. And, you know, what ended up happening is we actually ended up having to take two knobs and connect them to that one knob so they turn at the same time. Um, but you know, that's what turned into the density. And I sent that over to Chris, and that plugin that we sent over was a white plugin with two knobs on it that was called CG2, you know, as a test
Yeah.
name to send to Chris. And here we are.
And once you have it all mapped out, it's like a cheat sheet for transient low end design in mastering.
It is. It truly
Once it, like
and dude, it's so wild because everybody gets fucked up about density. Like loudness is pretty easy. It's like, oh, you take the song, turn it the fuck up, you know. Where everyone's like, what do you do with density? Like, how are you supposed to? I can't hear it, and it's like, well, one, stop for a second, just like breathe, and you'll hear it, you know. But two, the big thing for me, what I always explain to people is, you know, density is most prevalent in the low end. And if you can figure out your low end with density, then it's going to do beneficial things across the whole frequency spectrum. And how I tell people to go about doing it is to take density, turn it up to the point where you think that it sounds fat and flubby, like, oh, that's not where it should be, and then turn it back a little bit, you know? And then
mm.
you're usually in a position where you're like, okay, this is pretty good. Hold on one second, I'm getting a phone call.
What do you hope the reception of it? Like, what do you hope people do with it? Think about it.
You know, it's interesting because it actually it's lived a little bit longer than that. You know,
Okay.
we had the original knob, and Chris had CG2 when we were at AES in October. You know, so
Okay.
there's videos of us outside of the Javits with just a laptop telling people to come send your song to the laptop and turn it up, and there's just people in line. And back then, you know, we didn't have a name for it, and you know, we were just calling it the knob and making, you know, knob jokes and stuff. So to see it really turn into what I would consider a very powerful tool. You know, the tagline for CG2 that we have come up with is with great power comes great responsibility, you know? And that's how I feel is, you know, you could take this thing and you can crank a song up to -3 LUFS, you know, a lot more comfortably than you can with a lot of other things. Is that good? No, it's not, you know? Um, but you can also go and take a song that's living and feeling very, very great at -11 or -10 with peaks at 0, you know, and get that mix up to -7, -6, you know, a place where modern music has become comfortable um, very easily. And I think that that's really cool. Like for me, I've tried to be responsible with it. I just used it on a record that, you know, thankfully was for a very brief second the number one record in the world. And I was shooting for like -7. I wasn't trying to be the loudest person in the room. I was just trying to make sure that the record felt good and sounded good. And, you know, I had to work quick. And I did, you know. I have this joke has been it's not even a joke, but this story has been going around because there were people who witnessed it. But I'll say it here. You know, I did that Wiz Khalifa record. I mastered 23 songs in 24 minutes on AirPods on a back porch while smoking joints and eating Rolos in front of at least 7 other Nashville engineers while they timed me and it was a number one record. And there was no way in fucking hell that would have happened without CG2.
Interesting. Question. What do you think people won't understand about it then? That's what you want people to engage with and the value you see it brings to people. What do you think people will misunderstand, not quite click with on the plugin?
Well, I think that they're going to misunderstand exactly what I just said. Just because it was
Okay.
easy for me to do that, I'm very confident in my work. CG2 wasn't the only thing that I utilized. There was a pair of Sontecs, one in mid-side and one in stereo, that I utilized as my main tone shaping devices. I also had the pleasure of already having the single approved and released, so I had a pretty solid roadmap on what needed to happen for the rest of the record. This isn't a
Mm,
tool that you can go and just grab and turn anything up with no regard for the thing that you're turning up. You've got to feel good about your decisions before you use CG2, before I think you can ever feel really great about using CG2. That said,
mm,
there's been people who have been using CG2, and they've been cranking out what they call the loudest demos in Nashville. At some point, you know, um, if you understand this processor and learn to really get along with it, it can give you a competitive edge, which is like a really cocky thing to say. I think anybody's tools out there, if you go and really spend enough time to learn them, will give you a competitive edge because you know your tools well. But
mm.
this is one that allows you to do something special.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I think having confidence in your decision making is really important. Because they're and as you said, you had the roadmap there that helped inform you. You had the confidence in your decision making, regardless of what tools you had in front of you, and that's a good tool, and that's a tool that can't be bought. That's something that's decades of experience, and even on my end, like when I'm working on records, it doesn't matter what tools are at my availability. I can hear whether something sounds good or shit, and you got to discern that when you're using it. Interesting.
Yeah. Plus,
So so then,
I have a great resource in Ryan Harvey. While I
yeah,
moved quick because we were on a tight deadline and they needed their record back. He also does ridiculous quality control. If that sucked, he would have told me that it sucked. Thankfully, it didn't suck. So
yeah, yeah. And then so with this, do you at the start you're saying it removes, not it removes, but in terms of as a limiter, how did you word this? At the start, you go, you have so many limiters, they all have a different character or impart a different sonic characteristic. This allows you at the end to just lift it up.
yeah.
I'm
So you
paraphrasing really coarsely there, but
no
but
no
the
no.
core of what I
Go ahead.
sorry, the core I want to get into is this, do you want this to be perceived as a limiter or a loudness tool, or like what is the core perception of it?
In my mind, it's a loudness processor. I don't consider it a limiter.
Okay. Okay.
And
Interesting.
for example, on that Wiz record, I did use a limiter on one song. It was Ozone, Ozone Nine's Maximizer on
Yep.
algorithm 4 clean, or whatever that is. So transparent. But
Yep.
um, yeah, that was the only limiter I used. For the most part, the chain that I'm relying on for, I would say, 90% of my mastering work nowadays is typically two Sontecs, a de-esser, which is typically Precision de-esser from Metric Halo or Essence from DMG, and then
Yep.
CG2. So I try and make sure
Interesting.
that the song, the mix is feeling right before it goes in and gets turned up. And for me, those are all really split decisions. Like I can do that real quick. Like, Low end feels good. Top end feels good. Okay, lead vocal. Let's go after that. Where is it? Is it too SE? You know, and then from there, it's just like, okay, what happens when I turn it up?
Okay. And are you touching the density first or the loudness first?
Density.
Density always. And take me through your brain because I showed you my playbook,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
my playbook is very pragmatic,
You're
technical
using it
to the
like you're
ninth
using it like
degree.
a scientist. I love it. You know,
For you, what happens? Like what is the decision tree that goes in your mind as to whether or not you reach for that density knob, and if so,
I
how much?
I always reach for it. You know,
Okay,
I'm always a whoop whoop sort of guy. You know, on every song,
okay,
because uh, I got a mentor. His name's David Bendeth, and he believes, you never know what's out there unless you do it. So you got to go try
okay,
that to make sure that you've explored that option, to make sure that the option that you have decided on is the best option. So for me, yeah, that thing goes up, but it comes down, you know? So sometimes it doesn't get used at all. Other times it's like, okay, um, as I explained earlier, I turn the thing up until the point where I feel like it's gotten kind of fat and flubby, and then I turn it back down until I feel like that's kind of mellowed out and gone away. Um, and then
what's
from
fat
there,
and flubby for you? What's fat and flubby for you? Where the speakers are breaking out, or where their transients are moving? Like, how do you describe fat and flubby?
you can almost hear it when it comes to density. It almost sounds like the low end gets smeary.
Smeary.
Yeah, like
So
less
instead of like a
defined.
nice staccato, it's almost like a woolen mallet, like instead of a hard beater.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this, you know,
Okay.
kind of the shift where it's like all the low end goes out of focus a little bit.
Interesting. And when you're listening for that, actually, I shouldn't have been so descript, like
You're
with
fine.
mallet or beater. Are you, are your ears more attuned to the transient or the sustain or the release? Like, which portion of the dynamics are your ears tuning into on that?
Um, Hold on, sorry, I'm getting a bunch of text messages.
It's all good.
Um, Sorry, Chris has hit me up actually. It really depends on what it is, but it's typically that 150 to 400 hertz range in whatever the
Okay.
fucking bass instrument is. So that could be, a 808, that could be a live electric bass. Sometimes it's the Rhodes, or something like that. That's
Yeah.
like holding long chords, you know.
Yeah.
But it's typically it's not subs. It's not the super subs that I'm like
Yeah.
hearing that
Yeah. Yeah.
because that's more. I mean, let's be real, guys. Everybody who says I can hear 60 hertz, you feel 60 hertz, you interpret 60 hertz in your room, because there's
Ooh.
there's buildup
I don't
associated.
agree with that.
Oh, there's buildup
I
associated with that frequency. I mean, unless you're in
yeah.
in an anechoic chamber, you are not
Oh,
purely hearing just 60 hertz.
yeah.
So
Okay,
yeah,
I'll let you carry your thought. But
yeah,
yeah, keep going, man. It's
Um, so yeah, it's those frequencies that I feel like my ear can tune into very, very well, and not so much as interpret or feel, but actually hear well.
yeah. It's more about your confident decision making place where you're like, I know exactly how this should feel. If it's getting too flabby, I know exactly that's too flabby, and like that's where your ears are tuned to, and you're probably thinking of that relative to everything else in the mix. So you're like, is it too flabby relative to the top end, relative to the subs? Like, where does it position itself? And you find that your core sort of thing.
Absolutely, 100%. And also, since we're in mastering, we have some tools at our disposal to go after a mix engineer's decision making process, but ultimately some of those things our hands are tied on, and every year we get
Yep.
further away from being able to, have to leave their stuff alone, and we can change it. But um, really, if they did a good job and you're doing a good job not fucking up the good job that they did, then when you use something like the density control, it's not heavy handed enough that it's going to fuck up one thing and make something better. It either makes it all better or
Yeah.
fucks it all up?
Yep. Yep. I agree. You're very well voiced in the in the contemporary issues of a practicing engineer.
Oh, thank you.
Like outside of the technical sides, um, the anecdotes you share in terms of like, you get a good mix, and then a lot of people like, you can make it better, and that's the most how do I put it? That's the most poetic transformation of addressing mastering. But the reality is, when you get a good mix, it's more often than not, it's way more easier to fuck it up. So you
Oh,
want to avoid that at all costs. So no, it's really spot on. You're really outside of the 60 hertz, which I'm being a bit cheeky bringing that up.
it's
You
okay.
hit the nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head with the actual practicing, professional, engaging in a mix for somebody on the other side of a communication or engagement that needs something delivered. Um, you're right. You're right about many things. And I think outside of this being a plugin, and I will keep this stuff in the video because I think it's exceptionally valuable as an adjacent discussion to the plugin, is the practicing professional. So it's like, number one, if we're just considering the plugin, it's a great tool. They're very good use cases for it. But if you take the use cases away and you just go to the case study of engaging with the client, you've shared pretty good knowledge about, number one, uh, you don't want to fuck up a mix. So that you want to stay far away from. Number two, I think it's a really interesting. I think it was David Bennett. You
Mhm.
mentioned as a mentor. The exploration of sound, like that's a really good practical way to address engaging with it. Um, and and just in general, like there's another anecdote you said earlier on, and which is very true because I've been working on a lot of label stuff over the last 2-3 years in my career, and great mixers do mix loud. It is very reminiscent of what Chris sort of relayed to you in that discussion at breakfast. Yeah, people are super loud mixers. They sound great, and ultimately, if we really want to get into the practicalities of engaging in those sort of sessions, um, the A&R or the manager who sends it off wants to listen to something that is 9 times out of 10 has to be louder.
Yep. Yeah.
If it is not, they will not consider it.
Yep. Yeah,
They will ignore
absolutely.
it.
Yeah, and there's some people who haven't figured out how to do that well, and that used to be a whole separate profession where now a mixing engineer has to know how to get loud. And I hope that for some of them out there that this is a tool that will allow them to, get loud so that they can get their mix picked and that they can then take it off and then send it to Chris at Sterling Sound for a great master, or someone like yourself for a great master,
Yeah.
because they used it to be able to get loud the way that they needed to accomplish their job, but not the way that they wanted to for their final musical and artistic results, right?
Yeah, correct. And also, you can mix directly into this loudness knob,
Yep.
and tone wise, and I know this from practice and actually using it in mixing sessions. Once I get my gain structure set up, I got my mix bus set up. If I have the loudness bumping, I know that if like I bring a kick drum up or a vocal down or this at the other, the loudness function there isn't so reactive that it's going to shift the whole tone of the mix just because I change one element the way I'm driving it. So it's in a less roundabout way of saying, it's very transparent as a loudness tool.
Yeah,
So when you're mixing, you don't have to be too stressed about if you're hitting it too hard after you've gained a whole bunch of stuff up.
Well, yeah, and you just brought up a big point of what segues back right into the previous thing that I was just saying, which is nowadays if someone goes and mixes through a limiter to go and get loud, and they want to take that off to go send to a mastering engineer, the limiter forces them into so many creative decisions just because of the decisions it makes on its own, that some things fall apart. They don't sound the same. Where this is such a light-handed process. It's not a volume knob. I wish it was. But it's so incredibly clean at what it does that you can remove it for the most part, and a mastering engineer doesn't have to fight you. It's not like taking OTT off the mix or something like that, where you're going to fundamentally change your balance and structure.
Yeah. Yeah, you're 110% correct. That's exactly literally what I was trying to articulate. But the cheeky thing to say there, and it's not the 60 hertz, but the cheeky thing to say here about that process is that I think if you're, and this is not a marketing ploy, this isn't a sales pitch, this is a reality mastering engineers will have to face. If a mixing engineer is using this on their mix bus, that loudness, and then they take it off, unless a mastering engineer is very good at their job, like they all should be. All mastering engineer, any engineer who's performing well should be good at their job. They are going to struggle to get the same transparency of this limiter without actually having it themselves.
Yeah, and I
And
would I would have
I could imagine a lot of conversations where mixing engineers are going to go back to the mastering engineer and be like, have you heard my limited version? It sounds less squashed and it sounds more in tune with the original mix than the one you're sending back. What's going on? Oh, you
yeah.
don't have CG2.
Well, and we've ran into that before, just from our beta chat, at this point, one, it's gonna come back, less squashed or more squashed from your mastering engineer if they don't have CG2, because it's not a limiter, so it just is more open. But also, we've seen the wildest shit, even with people who that we love and believe in. People are willing to do whatever people want, and we've had people get masters approved by label management and artists that were negative 1.5 lufs, so that is music that is so incredibly dense, it will blow up your DAC on your iPhone. you know um, it's, yeah, you've got to be careful, and that's why I said with great power comes great responsibility. Ultimately, if people do want louder music, this is one tool to hopefully get them there cleaner. But for me, I think that this could give us the ability to have, what I would consider a relatively modern loudness that we live at currently that just sounds better. I don't
Yep.
want louder trap music. I want better sounding trap music. You know.
No, that's actually pretty. It's not completely unrealistic for what it does to have that sort of line of sight. Um, Man, I'm gonna wrap up this and thank you so much for your time, because there's so much juice and stress now for me to find all the amazing discussion and piece this together for people to enjoy. But thank you, man. I really do appreciate it.
I thank you. Thank you for taking your time to sit down and talk to me tonight, Nicholas. If there's anything you need, please say the word.